Has Father Stephen DeYoung or anyone else discussed house churches that evangelicals are convinced were just hangout sessions over lunch after a Sunday service? We're going to find a stream or video on this. I talk about this all the time. There was this is like an insane narrative from a lot of these random cults and churches. I went to a long time ago, before I was even really thinking about orthodoxy at all. I went with my sister to her daughter's baby dedication. So we went to their whole family, her husband's whole family is Seventh-day Adventist. So we go to this dedication, and the preacher there is talking about Constantine changed everything. There were no priests or anything in the early church. There were no pastors. There were no bishops. There were no nothing. It was just everybody sitting around together, telling each other how they evangelized for the day. So they would just get a little snack, get together, and have their little tea time and tell each other how they went around and talked about Jesus for the day. And that was it. That was the entire early church. So there is this insane narrative from people that, this was somehow the way the early church operated. It's completely delusional.
Yeah. So you have to understand what houses look like. Right? We have excavated house churches. Mm-hmm. This is not a mystery anymore. This is one of the things, right? In the 16th century, there was no archaeology. Like, archaeology as a concept did not exist at the time of the Reformation. So, yeah, they said a lot of things. You could just kind of project all kinds of things into the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now we know a lot more than they did, and so a lot of this stuff falls apart. So when you read about people meeting in someone's house in the book of Acts, okay, first of all, you're talking about a very wealthy person.
Yeah.
Right. A very wealthy person. They had a house with enough space to accommodate a group like that. Right. And so in Acts, everybody's going on the Sabbath to the synagogue still. Right. St. Paul's preaching in the synagogue, whoever's preaching in the synagogue. Right. Until they get thrown out of the synagogue, they're still going to the synagogue on Saturday. And then Saturday evening, the evening of the Sabbath, going into the Lord's Day, they would gather, and they would have what we would call today a vigil service. They'd go overnight. So think about when St. Paul is preaching and the kid falls asleep and falls out the window. That's because they're doing this all night, right? And then in the morning, they would celebrate the Eucharist. And so the quote-unquote house church is a room, sometimes a separate building if it was a big villa, depending on how rich of a person we're talking about, but or a building or a room which was dedicated to being used as a temple, meaning a dining hall. Temples in the ancient world had dining halls because sacrifices were about eating, right? And so the Eucharist was offered in essentially a dining hall, right? Which they understood to be functioning as a temple to offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist, right? And those Lord's Day gatherings for the Eucharist were just Christians. Christians and non-Christian Jews and Gentile God-fearers were all at the synagogue on the Sabbath. But on the morning on the Lord's Day, right, that day, they did it at daybreak because everybody had to go to work. So they didn't get the day off on Sunday, on the Lord's Day, right? And so they celebrated that together. But another thing, we know all of these houses, Roman houses, were covered in iconography. The pagan houses are covered in pagan iconography. Scenes from pagan myth and stuff, all over the walls, frescoes. Okay? And so when these people become Christian, they didn't just whitewash all their walls. They replaced the pagan iconography with Christian iconography, scenes from Scripture, right? Depictions, instead of scenes from pagan myth, scenes from the Christian Scriptures, right? And you see this at the meeting places in the catacombs, right? When you go in the catacombs to non-Christian areas, there's still iconography. It's just pagan iconography. Okay, the pagan iconography gets replaced with Christian iconography. And a pagan idol and pagan iconography were two different things within paganism, just within paganism, those are two different things, right? So these early house churches were covered in Christian iconography. They were essentially dining halls to celebrate the Eucharist on the Lord's Day. And they were dedicated areas of very wealthy people's homes or villas used for that purpose, and only that purpose. They did just sort of shift the chairs around in the living room in a circle, right?
Right. We're going to do the kumbaya thing.
Yeah, this was a dedicated area that was sacred space.